Quartered safe out here is George MacDonald Fraser's memoir of his experiences as a young soldier in the British Army during World War II's Burma campaign. Blending humor and stark realism, Fraser vividly recounts life on the front lines, capturing the camaraderie and harsh realities of war. Let's begin. Pyobwe fell the next day without a shot fired. A patrol from the battalion went into the town center at dawn, but the Japanese were either dead or had fled. More than 1,100 bodies were found on the ground, and 13 guns were abandoned. The Japanese army had finally, as Slim put it, been torn apart. While the remnants would continue to fight desperately in the jungles and swamps of southern Burma during the monsoon, they would never again form a coherent force. This makes a private soldier wonder why Tokyo, surveying its battered lines from Burma to the Pacific, did not acknowledge that all hope was lost and call it a day. But governments, of course, never do. They are not the ones lying with shattered limbs in the wreckage of a small room, too far gone to hear the footsteps outside the door. It must have been on that following day that we shifted our positions, for I remember a slow sweep across open, rubble-strewn ground where the Japanese had died in their tracks, their corpses lying where they had fallen, in stiff, grotesque attitudes. I do not recall any vultures or kites, perhaps our advance had scared them off. One body had its stomach ripped open, and the swollen intestines protruded like a great balloon. Someone pricked it with his bayonet, idly, and there was a most disgusting stench. "Oh Jesus, pack it up," cried Grandmas, and Nick looked about him, upbraiding the dead in withering terms. "You stupid sods. You stupid Japanese sods. Look at the bloody state of you. You would not listen, and now you are all bloody dead. Tojo's way. You dumb bastards. You could have been sipping tea and screwing geishas in your bloody little paper houses, and look at you. I do not know." He shook his head. "All the way from bloody Japan." If it sounds shocking, it did not at the time. Nick had a bitter sense of humor, but I am sure that on this occasion he was simply saying what he thought. He did not pity the Japanese, none of us did. If anything, he was angry, not only at the folly that those bodies represented but also because only yesterday they had been alive and trying to kill us. If he had added, "and serve you right," I would not have been surprised, or disagreed. There is much talk today of guilt as an aftermath of war, guilt over killing the enemy and even guilt for surviving. Much depends on the circumstances, but I doubt if many of the 14th Army lose much sleep over dead Japanese. For one thing, they were a no-surrender enemy, and if we had not killed them, they would surely have killed us. But there was more to it than that. It may appall a generation that considers racism the ultimate crime, but I believe there was a feeling, there was in me, that the Japanese were farther down the human scale than Europeans. It is a feeling I see reflected today in institutions and people who would hotly deny they are subconscious racists. The presence of TV cameras ensures a superficial concern for Kurdish refugees and Bangladeshi flood victims, but we all know the Western reaction would have been immeasurably greater if a similar disaster had occurred in Australia, Canada, or Europe. Some people seem to count more than others, with liberals as well as reactionaries, and it is folly to pretend that racial kinship and likeness are not at the bottom of it. As to the Japanese of 50 years ago, there is no question that they were viewed in an entirely different light from our European enemies. Would the atomic bomb have been dropped on Berlin, Rome, or Vienna? No doubt newspaper reports and broadcasts had encouraged us, civilians and military, to regard them as an evil, misshapen, buck-toothed barbarian who looked and behaved like something sub-Stone Age. The experiences of Allied prisoners of war demonstrated that the reports had not lied and reinforced the view that the only good Japanese was a dead one. And we were right, then. It is difficult for me to equate the Japanese of the 40s with those neat, eager, apparently polite young men whom I see in airports and tourist centers, bustling, smiling, and clicking their cameras. But old feelings persist, and I prefer not to sit beside them. Nor will I buy a Japanese car. For one thing, I think that German cars are better. And if I am a foolish and bigoted old man, I can only plead the excuse that apologists are forever advancing on behalf of modern criminals. Like them, I am a victim of my environment and upbringing. I need understanding. So, I suspect, do most of my old comrades who gave the best years of their lives, and sometimes life itself, to decreasing the population of Japan. Do not reproach them for it, but be thankful. As to old grudges and hatreds, well, one cannot help what one feels, and guilt and regret just do not come into it. At the same time, I remember watching, a year or two ago, televised interviews with old Japanese soldiers who had fought in the war and being conscious, despite myself, of a sort of, not sympathy, but a curious recognition of the wrinkled old men, sitting in their gardens in their sports shirts, blinking cheerfully in the sunlight, reminiscing in throat-clearing croaks about battles long ago. It crossed my mind, Were any of you on the Pyobwe slope and lived to tell the tale? Well, if they did, at this time of day I do not mind. We were at Pyobwe for a week, but it seemed longer, possibly because, all of a sudden, there was nothing very active to do, no guard duty, no patrols, no fatigues even. We were waiting for the war to catch up with us, and there was time to get a decent all-over bath, to collect our big packs from the trucks and rummage through them, to write letters at leisure, to reread and abandon the short story I had begun the night the Japanese broke through the wire, and to give kit and weapons a thorough going over. In my case, this included taking possession of a Tommy gun, much against my will. I had grown to love my old snub-nosed Lee Enfield and resented having to part with it, but it was usual for a section second in command to carry a Thompson if one were available, so I accepted the thing and detested it. It was ugly, ungainly, I had not been trained in its use or taught to regard it as a companion, and it could not have come within 10 feet of a falling plate at 200 yards. Its whole purpose was automatic, and my view was that if single-aimed shots had been good enough for the Duke of Wellington, they were good enough for me. For some reason, I felt like a bully just carrying it, and it rusted like an old bed frame. I eventually threw it in a Sitan Creek, but in the meantime, I had to go about like Lance Corporal Capone. I associate that week at Pyobwe with the first return to something like normal life since the campaign began. A mobile cinema arrived and showed us a film, Northern Pursuit, in which Errol Flynn was a dashing Mountie foiling Nazi agents in Canada. I assume he foiled them, for the projector broke down halfway through, to howls of rage from the groundlings. Flynn was in terribly bad odor at that time for having appeared in a movie called Objective Burma, which had given great offense in Britain because it had concentrated on America's part in the Burma campaign. It had been withdrawn from UK cinemas after outraged baying from the popular press and, I believe, politicians. That being so, a Flynn movie might have seemed an odd choice for a 14th Army audience, but it was not. Flynn, his absence from the war notwithstanding, was popular with the forces, who admired his lifestyle and wished they had half his bother. And we would have liked to see Objective Burma for ourselves, if only in the hope of discovering inaccuracies and being able to hurl abuse at the screen. In that, we would have been disappointed. I saw it years later, and it was an above-average war picture that may well have been a fair reflection of the Stilwell-Merrill operations in the North, for all I know. The Americans did play a supporting role in the Burma Land War, and if they wanted to make a movie about it, good luck to them. We liked war movies, British or American, but I realize that their popularity in wartime may seem strange nowadays when supersensitivity is the rule. I suppose it is natural enough to postpone the TV showing of an air disaster movie when there is a real air crash in the news, or even to withhold an American prison drama of the 40s at a time when rioters are hurling slates from the roof of a British jail. But when the showing of Carry On Up the Khyber was cancelled during the Gulf crisis because it showed comic British troops opposed to comic Muslims, one could not help recalling the delight with which wartime audiences hailed movies in which George Formby and Will Hay, among others, made merry of the struggle against the Nazis. No one took the war less seriously because of such entertainments, they did not offend taste, and far from undermining morale, they strengthened it. Times, and perhaps the sense of humor, have changed. Half of Northern Pursuit was not our only relaxation. A great bundle of magazines was distributed, and one of them contained, to Wedge's delight, a full-page pin-up of the idolized Susanna Foster displaying her celebrated legs. He affixed it to the rusted side of the railway wagon and contemplated it with deep-breathing worship, and even Grandmas was moved to admit that she was not a bad bit of stuff, which from him, was the equivalent of a poem from Herrick. I got 2 paperbacks from home that I had requested, Henry V, which we had done in my last year at school and for which I had developed a deep affection, and 3 Men in a Boat. Not that I was a devotee of Jerome's, but I had felt that comedy and a reminder of the beauties of the English countryside would not come amiss. I had also thought that it might be acceptable when passed around the section, but I did not expect any takers for Shakespeare, intellectual snob that I was. The result was instructive. I was lying on my ground sheet, renewing acquaintance with Jerome and the tin of pineapple, when Sergeant Hutton squatted down beside me. "What are you reading, then? What is this?" "Henry V, Bloody Hell, by William Shakespeare." He gave me a withering look and leafed over a page. Enter chorus. "Oh, for a muse of fire that would foot me." He rifled the pages. "Aye, well, we will have a look." And such is the way of sergeants, he removed it without "by your leave." That is one that will not be away long, I thought. I was wrong. 3 days later it had not been returned, and having exhausted Jerome and the magazines, I was making do with the 14th Army newspaper, SEAC, famous for its little cartoon character, Professor Flit, a jungle infantryman who commented memorably on the passing scene. And I was reading a verse by the paper's film critic. "I really do not care a heck for handsome Mr. Gregory Peck. But I would knock off work at 4 To see Miss Dorothy Lamour. When Hutton loafed up, tossed Henry V down beside me, and seated himself on the section grub box. A silence followed, and I asked if he had liked it. He indicated the book. Was Shakespeare ever in the army? I said that most scholars thought not, but that there were blanks in his life, so it was possible that, like his friend Ben Jonson, he had served in the Low Countries, or even in Italy. Hutton shook his head. If he was not in the army, I will stand tapping. He knows too bloody much about it, man. This was fascinating. Hutton was a military hard case who had probably left school long before the age of 14, and his speech and manner suggested that his normal and infrequent reading consisted of company orders and the sports headlines. But Shakespeare had talked to him across the centuries, admittedly on his own subject. I suggested hesitantly that the bard might have picked up a good deal just from talking to military men. Hutton brushed the notion aside. Never. You know those three, Bates and them, talking before the battle? You do not get that from listening in pubs, son. No, he has been there. He gave me the hard, aggressive stare of the Cumbrian who is not to be contradicted. That is my opinion, anyway. And those others, the Frenchmen, the noblemen, trying to kid on that they could not care less when they are scared out of their wits. Get away. And the constable taking the piss out of what's his name? The Dauphin. Aye. He shook his head in admiration. No, you have heard it all before, in different words, like. Those four officers, the Englishman and the Scotsman and the Irishman and the Welshman, I mean, he has got their chat off, has he not? You could tell which was which without being told. That Welshman, he laughed aloud, a thing he rarely did. Talk until the bloody cows come home, the Welsh. He frowned. No, I have never read anything by Shakespeare before, I mean, you hear the name, like, he shrugged eloquently. Mind, there are times I do not know what the hell he is talking about. You and me both, I said, wondering uneasily if there were more passages obscure to me than there were to him. He sat for a moment and then misquoted, and I am not sure that Shakespeare's version is better. There are not many that die well that die in a battle. By Christ, he is right there. It is a good bit, that. He got up. Thanks for the lend of it, Jock. I said that if he had liked it, he would like Henry IV too. Falstaff is bloody funny, and you would like Hotspur. Have you got it? I apologized that I had not and promised to write for it. By way of a trailer, I told him as much as I remembered of Hotspur's when the fight was done speech, but I am no Sean Connery, and although he nodded politely, I could see I was a poor substitute for the written word. He went off, leaving me to reflect that I had learned something more about Henry V and Shakespeare. In his own way, Hutton was as expert a commentator as Dover Wilson or Peter Alexander. He was a lot closer to Bates, Court, and Williams, and Captains Jamie and Fluellen, than they could ever hope to be. And I still wonder if Shakespeare was in the army. My other strongest memory of Pyobwe is of getting to know the Gurkhas, whose positions were close to ours and to whom I made regular visits to trade rations. As Grandma said, they would have sold their souls for tinned herrings in tomato sauce or sardines, and I only had to stroll across to their positions with a couple of the oval tins in my hand to be greeted with huge smiles and squeals of hey, Jock, chapati, dude, chini. Shabash. And out would come the sugar and condensed milk, or the big flat chapatis which they baked on their company fire, by way of exchange, the deal being cemented by the offer of cigarettes on my part and the acceptance of a huge mug of their sickly sweet tea, to be drunk sitting in the middle of a grinning, chattering group of those wonderful little men. There is nothing like tea in the afternoon, whether it is in snug comfort at home on a winter's day, or on the terrace of reeds or in the cool white peace of the old Raffles in Singapore, or the Hong Kong peninsula, even if they did put onion with the salmon sandwiches, or in an English tea shop. But having tea with the Gurkhas is something special, for they radiate a cheer and good fellowship that has to be experienced, and once you have, you understand why British soldiers have always held them in an affection that is pretty close to love. Exuberance is a poor word for their social behavior. Except for a few exchanges in broken Urdu, we could not converse, but having heard me addressed as Jock, they knew I was Scottish, which sent them into peals of delight, with half a dozen of them scurrying away to bring their company piper, who regaled me with Scotland the Brave and Cock of the North, while some of his comrades marched up and down, scowling horribly in what I took to be Caledonian imitation. One of them got so carried away that he suddenly leapt in front of me, grimacing and yelling, "Hey, Jock, Japani Mat Kara," which very loosely translates as death to the Japanese, and went into a violent pantomime in which he clove the air with his kukri, to enthusiastic applause, and then enacted the dying enemy, writhing on the ground screaming, "Banzai bus! Banzai bus!" and feigning death while his friends sat round and hurled abuse at his corpse. After which, they all collapsed in laughter, and we had some more tea. A Gurkha subaltern whom I met later told me that commanding a platoon of them was like leading a group of perfectly disciplined 10-year-olds, and I believe him. Watching them playing football, for example, was like watching very small children, for they had not the least idea of playing the game. They had no interest in teams or goals or anything of the sort. Their one idea was to chase the ball in a screaming, laughing mob, booting it as far as possible and running after it with their little skulls gleaming and pigtails bobbing, to boot it again. Unless chance directed the ball back to where they started, they were liable to vanish into the distance, yelling, "Football! Football!" And the extraordinary thing was that they did it properly dressed, with their puttees on and shirts buttoned at the wrists. Their only other recreation that I saw was the catapult, the wire and elastic toy which the Americans call a slingshot. Many Gurkhas carried them in their hip pockets, and if you were suddenly stung from behind and heard a smothered giggle from behind a tree, it was worth stopping and shouting, "Come here, Johnny. Let me see, you little bugger." Just for the pleasure of seeing the small face peeping cautiously out, followed by the marksman himself, wearing a sheepish grin and holding up his catapult by way of explanation, as if you did not know. So far as I could see, they confined themselves to British targets. There seemed to be no great love lost between them and the Indian regiments, especially the Sikhs, and we took it as a compliment. No one would have dreamed of taking offense. It would have been downright cruel, for the Gurkha was as eager to please as a playful grandchild. The thought of quarreling with one of them never even occurred. For one thing, you would be better picking a fight with a king cobra. That was a thing that was often hard to remember, that this delightful little man, with his ungainly walk and protruding backside and impish grin, who barely came up to your shoulder and was one of nature's born comedians, was also probably the most fatal fighting man on earth. Their reckless courage was legendary, and I imagine that, in proportion to their numbers, they must have won more Victoria Crosses than any other race in the army. I was never among them during an action, but I was once privileged to watch, from a distance, a company of them attacking a Japanese position. There was a Highland unit on their left, advancing with that slow, deliberate 110 paces to the minute tread that used to be the trademark of the kilted regiments. The Gurkhas had to trot to keep up, little green figures with their bush hats at the rakish Gurkha angle, each man with his rifle at the trail in his left hand and his drawn kukri in his right. Over the last few yards, the Highlanders suddenly accelerated, but any noise they made was drowned by the ear-splitting scream of the little hillmen going like demented dwarves, brandishing their knives as they scampered into the trees, and I was profoundly glad that I was not Japanese. One of the Highlanders told me later that when they came out again, they found the ground before the position littered with Gurkha rifles. Most of them had gone in with kukris alone. There was another occasion when a Gurkha platoon close to us held a position against 2 companies of Japanese who would not take no for an answer but kept coming time and again, yelling Banzai. The Gurkhas just stood fast and stopped them until the position was littered with Japanese dead. When the Gurkhas were finally withdrawn, it was discovered that they did not have a single round of ammunition left. I knew only one Gurkha really well, a fellow cadet at officers' training school after the war. Unlike the Gurkhas I had known in Burma, he was far from childlike, being as bright intellectually as anyone in the cadet company, but if he had a sharpness and dignity beyond the jolly little killers of the 17th Division, he was just as genial and given to merriment. Like many Gurkhas, he answered to the name of Topper, the H is silent, and played in front of me in the company soccer team, a quicksilver terrier of an inside man who was everywhere at once, clapping his hands and clucking jock 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 jock. Like a hysterical hen if I did not give him the ball fast enough, savaging opponents twice his weight and giggling as he held the goalkeeper's jersey at corner kicks, he was one who had learned the rules, and then some. Naturally, he was a general favorite in that company of young men, half of us British, the other half drawn from most of the warrior races of India. Topper was the only Gurkha, but there was also a black Nigerian and, I think, 1 or 2 Malays. It was a remarkable international mix with one common goal, a commission in His Majesty's forces, and I wish some of our race relations experts could have seen us and heard the entirely uninhibited mess discussions on politics. This was shortly before Indian independence and, just for interest, a majority of the Indian cadets were against it: religion, sport, military shop, social gossip, world affairs, and so on. Indeed, I wish I had tapes of them myself. Our average age would be in the early 20s, ranging from pink schoolboys from England to a gnarled Pathan. He must have been all of 29, with 3 rows of ribbons, and we talked and argued with a freedom that would have had a television discussion host reaching for his panic button. One result of this was that I saw a most disturbing phenomenon: an angry Gurkha. We were talking politics, and a clever and articulate Congress Party supporter, who happened to be extremely swarthy, got very emotional. "You British," he cried, "with the help of this type of people here," he indicated Topper and a couple of Sikhs, "have been exploiting this land for centuries. You have bled India white." One of the Sikhs murmured behind his gin and tonic, "It hasn't had much visible effect on you, which was well below the belt, but it might have passed if the Nigerian had not laughed fit to rattle the chandelier. Topper elbowed him, muttering to him to shut up, and the Congress boy, mistaking the gesture, rounded on Topper and was ill-advised enough to call him a monkey bastard. Topper's grin vanished as though it had been wiped off. He did not say anything, just stared at the other, and then suddenly turned and ran out of the mess. Some of us went after him, calling him to come back, but he ran full tilt to his quarters, where we found him unearthing his cookery from a tin trunk while his native bearer gibbered in a corner. Topper was mouthing dreadful things about sons of owls and swine, and it took 4 of us to wrestle him down while some brave soul stood on his wrist and secured the cookery. Then we sat on him until the senior under-officer arrived, by which time he had stopped struggling and we judged it safe to let him go. But he was still grey with rage, and when the SUO had finished tearing strips off him, he flatly announced his intention of killing the Congress boy at the earliest opportunity. There was no doubt whatever that he meant it. We reasoned with him, literally for hours, pointing out that he would certainly hang for it. That meant nothing, and it was only when the SUO, inspired, assured him that as a murderer he had not a hope of a commission that he showed signs of weakening. Finally, roundabout lights out, he gave his word of honor not to avenge the insult, provided the Congress wallow apologized, which I am bound to say the latter did with a good grace. But Topper would not shake hands or even look at him thereafter, and he was never quite the same cheery companion again. I suppose he is dead now. Gurkhas are not noted for longevity, and I sometimes wonder where the Congress boy is, and the laughing Nigerian, and the Sikh whose snide crack started it all. With the army reduced to a shadow of its old self, there are many fewer Gurkhas in British service nowadays, and they look subtly different from the happy little toughs of 40 years ago. They are taller and better shaped, and the broad, grinning faces I remember have given way to more refined and serious features. The race can hardly have changed in so short a time, and I wonder if they are being recruited with a view to size. Or perhaps I am just imagining the change. Even half a century ago, a Gurkha on parade was as regimental and poker-faced a soldier as any, and it was only up the road, with his catapult in his pocket and his pigtail and cookery bouncing as he trotted along, that you got the big grin, the cheery wave, and the high-pitched yell of shabash, jock, Rangoon Jow. That is how I remember him and always will. Towards the end of our week at Pyobwe, I went for a walk at random to think about things. A letter from my parents had referred to the imminent collapse of Germany and the possibility of the whole war being over soon. It must have been natural at home to suppose that once Hitler was out of the way, the whole Axis would collapse, but the thought had not even crossed 9 sections' mind. We were in our own hot little world, our own private war, and it would not be over until we reached Rangoon, 300 miles due south, with the Japanese in between. It might well not be over even then. There would still be Malaya and Siam to clear, as far as Bangkok and Singapore. In Delhi and London, they might know that the Japanese position in Burma was beyond repair, but that did not mean a great deal at our level. He had been bad to shift in the first 100 miles south of the Irrawaddy, and with 3 times that distance still to go, the outlook was not promising. It is all in the point of view. Armchair strategists can look at the last stages of a campaign and say there is nothing left but mopping up, but if you are holding the mop, it is different. The last Japanese in the last bunker on the last day can be just as fatal to you personally as the biggest battle at the height of the campaign, and you do not look or think much beyond him, wherever he is. Perhaps you have to be an old soldier, watching the TV news telling you that the Iraqis are on the run and another couple of days will do it, and hip hip hooray it will be a glorious victory and the boys will be home before you know it, to feel mounting anger as you watch pictures of the tanks rolling and staff officers looking confident at press conferences and studio pundits pontificating, because you know, even if the complacent commentators do not, that some poor soul is still at the sharp end hoping to God that bunker is empty and that the ground before it is not mined. Forgive me if all my sympathy is with Jamie and Fluellen and Bates, Court, and Williams. After all, what else are the commentators going to say? So, in April 45 we did not think of the war ending. It would happen someday, but in the meantime, what was the name of the next Japanese stronghold down the road, and would our company have to take it? It is strange, thinking back and remembering, you find yourself falling into the habits of 45 years ago. Complain, 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 moan, moan, moan. That is how soldiers are. Before you know it, I will have developed sore feet just sitting at my typewriter. As I walked that afternoon, I was digesting the fact that my parents had reached that stage of desperate hope when the end is in sight. Churchill's broad, sunlit uplands were coming into view, and the closer that prospect seemed, the more they must have worried and asked themselves for the 1000th time what cruel fate had determined that while other campaigns were ended or ending and other people's children could be accounted safe, their wandering boy should be caught up on the last front of all. It must have been a bitter thought, but they kept it to themselves, Their last letter had been full of optimism and even talk of what I might do after the war. Resit my exams in the hope of getting into medicine? That, I knew, was what they wanted, and in my first year in the army I had gone along with it, even to the extent of getting Hire's papers from the education office and brooding disconsolately over Livian quadratics and volumetric analysis, whatever that was. I had not the heart to tell them now that I had about as much chance of getting into medicine as I had of beating Joe Davis at snooker. It was not that war had blunted my brain and blighted my hopes, it was just sheer bloody laziness, reinforced by distaste at the thought of peering at boils and rectums. Or should it be recta? Which reminded me of the old military joke about the fellow who was wounded in the backside. Rectum? Bloody near killed him. No, I had only one ambition now, to get my commission. It was sheer naked pride, nothing else. I thought, with all the conceit of youth, that I was good enough. Better equipped, too, than those contemporaries who had passed where I had failed and would now be dispersing from their officer cadet training units with their new pips, wondering what active service would be like and whether they could lead people in action. I knew what it was like now, and that if I shouted, "Come on, Grandmas, Parker, Nick, Forster," they would follow, even if I did fall down a well along the way. Yes, I would pass the next ward if I had to kill the psychiatrist to do it, and get through OC2, and with Burma in my paybook, I would apply for the Gurkhas. Oh Lord, I would have to learn Ghakkali as well as Urdu, or the Dogras, or if I opted for British service, the Gordons, my family's regiment, or the Black Watch, provided the war lasted long enough, for I suppose that once it was over, there would be no demand for new subalterns, which shows how little I knew. In a way, my problem was the reverse of Dr. Grantley's, who did not want his father to die, but since he was going to anyway, could he not get a move on so that Grantley could succeed to the bishopric before the government fell? My thought was that the war was going to end, and the sooner the better, obviously, but since it would not be tomorrow, could it last at least until I hoisted my first pip? Assuming I survived it, of course. Well, it was not up to me, I would just have to wait until the tumult and the shouting were fading, and remind Long John of my ambition. So I reflected, as I wandered through the rubble-strewn outskirts of Pyobwe, pausing by the railroad track where the sappers or the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers had got a handcart scooting along the rusted rails as a preliminary to opening the line again. I strolled on and sat down for a smoke and quiet survey of our positions and the town buildings in the distance. I was in a shady spot, with my back to a half-ruined wall, watching the geckos on the rocks, one moment motionless and the next motionless again after a lightning scuttled too fast for the eye to follow. Only when I got up did I realize that the wall I had been leaning on enclosed the little room where that wounded Japanese soldier had been a week ago. I took a look inside. There was the pile of rubbish where he had been lying, had he been asleep, or half unconscious with his wound, when we approached. Possibly, he had not known I was there until I was inside the door when he had grabbed for his rifle. If he had been wide awake, he would have had it in his hands, covering the doorway, waiting. In which case, I probably would not have been standing here now, speculating about the Gordons and the Gurkhas. Wedge and Morton would have got him. I went back to the pits thinking. £2,000 of education. Drops to a 10 rupee jezail. And wondering how much my education had cost, and how many rupees it would take to buy a Japanese .300 rifle. 9 section was not at the pits, they had walked across to the main highway, a battered bit of tarmac that would not have qualified as a B road at home. Men were marching down it, past our positions and towards the town, long lines of jungle green and bush hats, one section on the right margin of the road, the next on the left, the third on the right, and so on, that way you do not eat the dust of the section in front. They were swinging along in battle order, looking just like us, except that they were a little less shop-soiled, and they were whistling in unison Bladen races. I am ready to swear to that tune in court, and it has been in my mind for 40 years that they must have been Northumberland Fusiliers, our friends from over the fells, or perhaps Durham Light Infantry, for who else would whistle the Geordie national anthem? But I searched the official histories index in vain for those 2 regiments, and for the Sherwood Foresters. I looked for them because I have a vague memory that as I joined the section to watch the march past, Parker was quoting, "The Knots and Jocks are a lousy lot. They lost their colours in Aldershot." Which is a well-known libel on the men of Sherwood. So what regiment they were remains a mystery, but everyone knew what division they belonged to, and 9 section let the light of its collective countenance shine on them. "Hey, Wedge, where are you, you moaning bugger?" cried Nixon. "You have been asking after them every night. Well, there they are, at long last, so take a good look. The flaming arseholes." Wedge contemplated them with a kind of rapture he reserved for Miss Foster's pin-up. "5th Division," said he, like a man whose ship has finally come in. "5th Division. High bloody time, and all," said Grandmas. They were meant to come through us in Maktilo. Remember? We were the anvil, and they were meant to be the bloody hammer. Idle buggers. He raised his voice. Hey, what the hell kept you? The corporal of a passing section raised 2 derisory fingers. 6 months leave in paint jungle, what the hell do you think? We were waiting for you lot to get out of the way. Cheeky bugger, cried Gramas, grinning. Aye, well, Rangoon is down that way, lad. Just keep going, and if you drop anything, do not fret, we will pick it up. The corporal waved, and then they were past, and Bladen Races was faint in the distance. To a military psychologist, Gramas's brief, good-natured exchange with the corporal might have been significant. 5th Division had been meant to relieve us at Maktilo, and it had not happened, no fault of 5th Division's, just the necessities of war that had brought us south in a hurry to throw the Japanese out of Pyobwe. But if you are Gramas, or better still, Forster, here is fine fuel for grievance. In no time, you are convinced that you fought 5th Division's battle for them, and bellyache accordingly, and not just at the time, either. I can hear it, in some ex-service club 40 years on. Bloody 5th Division. Should have come through us at Maktilo, but did they hell? So we had to carry the can at Pyobwe, by Christ, I sweated that day, I will tell you. What? And where were the flaming arseholes, eh? All right, Jonty, I will have a pint, and a small rum. Good lad. But do not talk to me about bloody 5th Division, etc., etc. This being the case, you would have expected Gramas to be hurling dogs abuse at 5th Division when they finally came through, but all he came out with was mild pleasantry. He seemed quite glad to see them, and sped them on their way with good wishes. And not just because they were taking the lead in the next stage of the fighting. No, Gramas was looking farther ahead by now. He had his eyes on a distant goal, which he was confident could be attained, thanks to the system whereby we and 5th Division worked in tandem, first one taking the lead, then the other. I shall let Gramas himself explain. It is like this, sister. How far are we from Rangoon? 300 miles, right. Now, if 5th Division had come through us at Maktilo, we would have been coming through them again just about now. Instead, they are coming through us. Now then, I reckon they will be kept in front until they are about halfway to Rangoon, and then we will leapfrog them and get there first. See what I am getting at? If they had come through at Maktilo, like they were meant to, they would have been first to Rangoon. As it is, the buggers have had it. We will be the ones that take Rangoon. Barrack room logic at its ripest, plus a fair measure of wishful thinking, but it explained why he had forgotten his fancied grievance against 5th Division. The truth was, however he might gripe and moan, however he might revile the military hierarchy from Hutton to Mountbatten, however he might hate the war and the Far East and wish to God he was shot of them, in spite of all this, Gramas wanted Rangoon. He was not alone, the whole 17th Division wanted Rangoon, with a fervor that had been growing steadily since we crossed the Irrawaddy. In a way, the far-off city had assumed an almost mystic quality, like the High Barbary or Never Never Land or Tir Na Nog. It was the ultimate prize of a long and dreadful war, and once it was taken, Burma would be part of military history. Perhaps Slim's speech by the lake had something to do with it, perhaps there was a hope that the big boats would sail thence indeed. Whatever the reason, the Black Cats had come to regard Rangoon as a personal prize. After all, 17th Division, God Almighty's own, was the oldest formation in 14th Army, had borne the heated impel, had led the way south of the Irrawaddy, and broken the Japanese in the dry belt. No one would have dreamed of minimizing what other divisions had done, but no one had a better right to the first sight of the gilded Shui Dagon Pagoda and the Gulf of Martaban. Or as Gramas put it, I haven't come this bloody far for nothing. You are just a bloody glory hunter, you, said the Duke. You will be shouting gung-ho. In a minute. Want to tell your grandchildren how you took Rangoon, do you? Why not? All I am saying is, we are entitled, not the bloody flaming arseholes or the cross keys or anything like them, said Gramas stubbornly. Any roads, bar Mandalay, it is the only place in bloody Burma that anyone has ever heard of. That concludes the 8th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please consider subscribing for more episodes.